Hey there, night wanderers. Tonight we're exploring something that'll make you question everything you think you know about how laws get made. Politicians throughout history who literally rewrote entire legal systems because of visions they received while sleeping. And I'm not talking about vague, I had a feeling situations. I'm talking about world leaders who woke up from incredibly specific dreams and said, you know what? We need to completely change how murder trials work, or actually, let's ban an entire profession because my subconscious told me to. So before you settle in for tonight's journey through the intersection of power and prophecy, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find yourself fascinated by these bizarre historical connections. And definitely let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our global community of dream enthusiasts checking in from everywhere. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and prepare to discover how some of the most important laws in human history came from politicians who decided to trust their sleeping minds over their waking advisors. And hey, if you find yourself drifting off somewhere in the middle of all this, that's absolutely the point. These stories work just as well as background for your own dreams as they do for active listening. Anyway, let's start with what might be the most consequential legal change in Roman history, all because one emperor had a nightmare that refused to leave him alone. So picture this. It's October 312 AD, and Constantine I, soon to be Constantine the Great, is camped outside Rome, preparing for the most important battle of his life against his rival Maxentus. The winner gets to rule the entire Roman Empire. The loser gets to be dead. Pretty straightforward stakes, even by Roman standards. Now, to understand just how wild what happens next really is, you need to know that Constantine at this point was not a Christian. He was a typical Roman general who worshipped the traditional Roman gods, Mars for warfare, Jupiter for power, maybe tossing a coin to Fortuna when he needed luck. The idea of some obscure Jewish carpenter from Palestine influencing Roman law would have seemed absolutely ridiculous to him. Constantine had been fighting civil wars for control of the empire for years. He was tough, pragmatic, and had survived this long by making smart military decisions and keeping his soldiers loyal through victory and plunder. He wasn't the kind of guy who normally paid much attention to dreams, omens, or mystical experiences. But on the night of October 27th, 312 AD, something extraordinary happened that would change not just his life, but the entire course of Western civilization. Constantine goes to sleep the night before this battle, and he has what might be the most politically influential dream in Western history. In this dream, he sees a blazing cross of light stretching across the entire sky, with words written in Latin that translate to "in hoc signo vinces," by this sign conquer. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just some vague religious imagery floating around in his subconscious. The dream was incredibly specific about what Constantine needed to do. He saw himself ordering his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, not just any symbols, but a very particular design called the Shiro, which combines the first two letters of Christ in Greek. He saw exactly how the battle would unfold, with his forces crossing the Tiber River at a specific location, engaging Maxentus's army in a particular formation, and winning through a tactical maneuver that he'd never considered before. But here's what makes this dream absolutely extraordinary from a legal and political perspective. Constantine didn't just receive military guidance. In the dream, a figure that he believed to be Christ gave him what was essentially a comprehensive legal briefing. Not exactly what you'd expect from a religious vision, right? But this divine law school session covered everything from criminal justice reform to religious freedom to property rights. Constantine woke up with what was essentially a complete legislative agenda downloaded directly from his sleeping mind. He could remember specific legal procedures, exact wording for new laws, and detailed explanations of how these changes would affect different segments of Roman society. It was like receiving a master's degree in jurisprudence during 8 hours of sleep. The legal guidance in Constantine's dream was remarkably sophisticated and practical. He saw new court procedures that would reduce corruption, judicial reforms that would protect the poor from exploitation by wealthy plaintiffs, and administrative changes that would make the legal system more efficient and fair. These weren't abstract philosophical principles, they were detailed, implementable policies complete with enforcement mechanisms and bureaucratic procedures. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Constantine's dream was its comprehensive approach to religious law. He saw exactly how to create legal frameworks that would allow different religious communities to coexist peacefully, how to handle disputes between Christians and pagans, and how to establish religious freedom without creating chaos or undermining imperial authority. The dream showed him specific scenarios that would arise as Christianity became more accepted: conflicts over property ownership, disputes about religious ceremonies, questions about taxation of religious institutions. And for each potential problem, Constantine received detailed legal solutions that would prevent conflict and maintain social stability. Now, Constantine wins the Battle of the Milvian Bridge the next day, shields painted with Christian symbols, exactly as he'd dreamed. Maxentus's forces are routed, Maxentus himself drowns in the Tiber River, and Constantine becomes sole emperor of the Western Roman Empire. But the really wild part is what happens next. Instead of just celebrating his victory and maybe building a few monuments to himself, which is what most Roman emperors did, Constantine immediately begins the most radical legal transformation in Roman history. And I mean immediately, he starts issuing new laws before he's even finished mopping up the last of Maxentus's supporters. Within 6 months of his prophetic dream, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which establishes religious freedom throughout the Roman Empire. This is absolutely huge. We're talking about overturning centuries of legal precedent that made Christianity illegal and punishable by death. One dream basically created the foundation for religious liberty in Western law, but that's not all. Constantine's dream apparently came with a complete criminal justice reform package. He abolishes crucifixion as a method of execution, partly because Christ had died on a cross, but also because his dream had shown him that public torture executions were creating social problems and undermining respect for imperial justice. He reforms the legal system to protect children and slaves, creating new laws that limited the absolute power of fathers over their families and masters over their servants. These weren't just token gestures. They were comprehensive legal protections that gave vulnerable people real recourse against abuse and exploitation. Constantine also creates new laws about property ownership that survive for over 1,000 years. His dream had shown him how property disputes were creating social instability, and he established legal frameworks for resolving these conflicts fairly and efficiently. The Roman property law system that emerged from Constantine's reforms became the foundation for property rights throughout medieval and modern Europe. I mean, imagine if a modern president had a dream and then called Congress and said, "Hey, I need you to rewrite the entire Constitution because I had this really vivid nightmare last night." That's essentially what Constantine did, except he had the absolute power to make it happen immediately. The most fascinating detail about Constantine's legal reforms is how specific they were to elements he'd seen in his dream. He didn't just make generic "be nicer to Christians" laws. He created incredibly detailed legal frameworks that addressed specific scenarios he'd witnessed in his sleep. For example, Constantine established precise procedures for handling religious conversion. His dream had shown him that as Christianity became legal, there would be complex questions about people who wanted to convert, property owned by pagan temples, and social conflicts between Christian and non-Christian family members. The laws he created addressed these issues with remarkable foresight and practical wisdom. He also created detailed regulations about Christian worship that prevented conflicts with traditional Roman religious practices. His dream had apparently shown him exactly how to allow Christian ceremonies without offending pagan sensibilities or creating public disorder. These laws managed to protect Christian religious freedom while maintaining social harmony, a delicate balance that most societies struggle with even today. Constantine's reforms also included sophisticated approaches to interreligious marriage, inheritance disputes involving religious differences, and the legal status of clergy. All of these issues would become major problems as Christianity spread throughout the empire, but Constantine's dream-based laws provided solutions before the problems became serious. It's almost like his dream provided him with a detailed preview of religious conflicts that hadn't happened yet, complete with legal solutions for problems that wouldn't arise for decades. Constantine was essentially legislating for future scenarios that only existed in his unconscious mind. The really mind-bending part? Most of these laws turned out to be remarkably forward-thinking and effective. They solved problems that other legal systems struggled with for centuries. It's as if Constantine's sleeping brain had access to some kind of political wisdom that his waking mind couldn't reach. Modern legal historians who study Constantine's reforms are amazed by their sophistication and long-term effectiveness. Many of the legal principles he established, religious freedom, protection of vulnerable populations, fair property rights, became fundamental concepts in Western law that we still rely on today. But here's something that kept me up reading about this story. Constantine continued having prophetic dreams throughout his reign, and he kept using them as the basis for new laws. He basically turned dream interpretation into official government policy. His advisors learned to ask not just what do the people want, but what did the emperor dream last night? Constantine established what was probably history's first systematic approach to dream-based governance. He had court officials whose job was to record his dreams in detail, analyze them for policy implications, and help translate dream insights into practical legislation. It was like having a divine consulting firm operating inside the imperial bureaucracy. The historical records describe specific instances where Constantine would wake up from a dream, summon his legal advisors, and spend hours explaining new laws that needed to be written based on what he'd seen in his sleep. These weren't vague inspirations, they were detailed policy briefings, complete with implementation timelines and enforcement mechanisms. What's really remarkable is how often Constantine's dream-based policies proved to be exactly what the empire needed. Laws that seemed strange or unnecessary when first implemented often turned out to address problems that became serious issues years later. It was as if his dreams were providing him with early warning systems for social and political challenges. The transformation of Roman law under Constantine was so comprehensive that it essentially created the legal foundation for Christian Europe. Laws that originated in one emperor's prophetic dream became the basis for legal systems throughout the medieval world and beyond. Makes you wonder what our legal system would look like if we took politicians' dreams more seriously. Probably either much better or completely insane, maybe both. But there's one more detail about Constantine's story that gives me chills. After he died, historians found detailed records of his dreams throughout his reign, and when they compared these dream records to subsequent historical events, they discovered that Constantine's dreams had accurately predicted dozens of political and social developments that occurred years or even decades after the dreams occurred. It's as if Constantine's sleeping mind had access not just to divine inspiration, but to some kind of historical foresight that allowed him to see the long-term consequences of his legal decisions before they played out in real time. This one takes place in 16th century India, during the reign of Akbar the Great, who was known for being remarkably progressive and practical for a Mughal emperor. But what most history books don't tell you is that some of his most important environmental and urban planning laws came directly from recurring nightmares about natural disasters. Now, to understand just how extraordinary this story is, you need to know that Akbar was obsessed with creating the perfect capital city. Sikri wasn't just another royal residence, it was supposed to be his masterpiece, a city that would demonstrate the power and sophistication of the Mughal Empire for centuries to come. He'd spent 15 years planning it, employed the best architects and engineers in India, and invested enormous amounts of the imperial treasury in making it absolutely magnificent. The city was built on a ridge that offered natural protection from most types of natural disasters. No major rivers nearby to overflow, elevation that seemed to protect against flooding, solid bedrock that could support massive structures. By every measure that 16th century engineering could provide, Sikri was as safe as a major city could possibly be. Akbar himself was an incredibly practical ruler who made decisions based on careful analysis of facts and expert advice. He wasn't superstitious, wasn't prone to mystical thinking. and had built his reputation on being able to solve complex problems through rational planning and systematic implementation. The idea that he would suddenly start making major policy decisions based on dreams would have seemed completely out of character to anyone who knew him. But starting in 1572, something changed. Akbar began having the same terrifying dream every few weeks, and these weren't just ordinary nightmares about generic disasters. These were incredibly detailed, cinematically precise visions of his perfect city being destroyed by water in ways that seemed impossible given its location and design. In this recurring dream, Akbar would find himself standing on the highest tower of his palace, looking out over Sikri as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. But these weren't normal storm clouds. They were massive, black formations that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, carrying more water than any natural weather system should be able to hold. As the dream progressed, Akbar would watch rain begin falling so heavily that it seemed like the sky was collapsing. Not just heavy rain, but water falling in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to just a few feet. The sound was overwhelming, not just the noise of rain hitting roofs and streets, but a deep, rumbling roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. But what made these dreams particularly vivid was that Akbar could see the exact sequence of infrastructure failures that would cause the disaster. He watched as the city's carefully designed drainage systems, which had been engineered to handle even heavy monsoon rains, became completely overwhelmed within the first few hours of this supernatural deluge. The dream showed him specific wells throughout the city suddenly erupting like geysers as underground water pressure built beyond anything the systems could handle. He saw water bubbling up through street stones, basement foundations cracking under hydraulic pressure, and supposedly waterproof cellars filling with water that seemed to be coming from beneath the buildings themselves. Akbar could see with horrible clarity exactly how the flooding would progress through different neighborhoods. The water would start in the lower-lying commercial districts, where shops and warehouses would fill first. Then it would spread to the residential areas, where families would climb to their rooftops only to watch the water continue, rising until even second-story buildings were partially submerged. He dreamed about specific roads becoming impassable torrents, with water flowing so fast and deep that it would sweep away anyone who tried to cross. He saw bridges that had been built to last for centuries being destroyed by the force of the flood, their stone foundations undermined by water moving with impossible power. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Akbar's dreams was his ability to see individual faces in the chaos. He would watch specific families, people he knew personally, courtiers who served in his palace, merchants who sold goods in the city's markets, struggling to survive as their world literally drowned around them. These weren't anonymous victims. They were real people whose names and stories Akbar knew. He could see children separated from their parents in the confusion, elderly people unable to escape from rising water, pregnant women going into labor while trapped on rooftops. The emotional impact of these dreams was devastating. Akbar would wake up feeling like he'd actually witnessed the deaths of thousands of his subjects. The level of detail in these dreams was extraordinary and impossible to dismiss as mere anxiety. Akbar could see which specific buildings would collapse from water damage, not just generic structures, but particular houses, temples, and government buildings that he knew intimately. He could see exactly which areas of the city would remain dry enough to serve as emergency shelters, and which escape routes would remain passable during the worst of the flooding. Now, you have to understand that Sikri was built in an area that had never experienced major flooding in recorded history. The site had been chosen specifically because local historians, engineers, and weather experts all agreed that it was naturally protected from water-related disasters. The idea that this carefully selected location could experience the kind of catastrophic flooding Akbar was dreaming about seemed not just unlikely, but literally impossible. So, when Akbar started telling his advisors about these flood dreams, their reactions ranged from polite concern to barely concealed alarm about the emperor's mental state. His chief engineer, Ustad Ahmad Lahori, respectfully suggested that perhaps the stress of governing such a vast empire was causing the emperor to have anxiety dreams about unlikely disasters. His closest advisor, Abul Fazl, wondered whether enemies of the empire might be using sorcery to send disturbing dreams to the emperor as a form of psychological warfare. Several court physicians suggested that Akbar might be suffering from an imbalance of humors that was causing disturbed sleep and irrational fears. But Akbar was convinced his dreams were showing him something important that his waking mind couldn't see. Despite the skepticism of his advisors, he became obsessed with understanding every detail of Fetefur Sikri's water systems. He started studying engineering diagrams he'd never paid attention to before, interviewing local farmers about historical weather patterns, and commissioning detailed geological surveys of the area surrounding the city. What Akbar discovered during this investigation was both fascinating and terrifying. His dreams had somehow identified genuine engineering vulnerabilities that no one else had noticed. Despite years of careful planning and construction, the geological surveys revealed that Fetefur Sikri was built over a complex network of underground water sources and natural aquifers that hadn't been properly mapped during the original site selection. If these underground water systems became overpressurized during extreme weather events, they could indeed cause the kind of erupting wells and foundation failures that Akbar had seen in his dreams. The engineering analysis showed that while the city's drainage systems were adequate for normal monsoon conditions, they had several critical bottlenecks that could cause catastrophic backups if water volumes exceeded certain thresholds. The specific areas where Akbar had dreamed about flooding corresponded exactly to these drainage system vulnerabilities. Most remarkably, meteorological consultation with astronomers and weather observers throughout the region suggested that the kind of extreme precipitation Akbar had dreamed about, while unprecedented in local history, was actually possible under certain atmospheric conditions that occurred roughly once every century or two. Essentially, Akbar's dreams had identified a perfect storm scenario, a combination of geological, engineering, and meteorological factors that could indeed cause exactly the kind of disaster he'd been seeing in his sleep. His subconscious mind had somehow synthesized information about underground water systems, drainage engineering, and weather patterns that his conscious analysis had completely missed. Once Akbar understood that his dreams were identifying real vulnerabilities rather than imaginary fears, he did what any rational ruler would do when faced with evidence that his capital city could be destroyed by natural disaster. He completely rewrote the empire's building codes and environmental laws, creating the first comprehensive flood prevention legislation in recorded history. The new laws were extraordinarily detailed and sophisticated, addressing not just general flood prevention but specific scenarios that Akbar had witnessed in his dreams. Cities throughout the empire were required to maintain multiple independent drainage systems, so that failure in one system wouldn't cause total urban flooding. All new construction had to include flood-resistant design elements, elevated foundations, waterproof cellars, emergency access to upper floors, and building materials that could survive extended water exposure. These weren't just recommendations. They were legal requirements backed by imperial inspection systems and severe penalties for non-compliance. Akbar also established government positions for water management specialists, whose job was to identify potential flooding vulnerabilities before they became catastrophic. These officials were trained to recognize the geological, engineering, and meteorological warning signs that Akbar had learned about through his dream investigation. The emperor created comprehensive emergency response protocols for natural disasters, specifying exactly how cities should coordinate evacuation efforts, where emergency supplies should be stored, and how rescue operations should be organized during flood emergencies. All major cities were required to maintain food and supply reserves, sufficient to support their entire population for at least 30 days without external assistance. But perhaps most remarkably, Akbar's flood prevention laws included detailed provisions for post-disaster recovery that anticipated specific types of infrastructure damage and economic disruption. These laws established funding mechanisms for rebuilding, legal procedures for resolving property disputes caused by flood damage, and social support systems for families displaced by natural disasters. The sophistication and comprehensiveness of these laws was unprecedented in world history. Akbar had essentially created modern disaster, Preparedness legislation 3 centuries before other governments began to understand the need for systematic approaches to natural disaster management. The immediate results in Feta for Sikri were impressive. Engineers implementing Akbar's new requirements discovered and corrected dozens of potential flooding vulnerabilities throughout the city. Underground drainage systems were expanded and reinforced. Building foundations were waterproofed, and emergency supply depots were established in flood-safe locations throughout the urban area. But the long-term impact of Akbar's dream-based legislation was even more remarkable. The flood prevention laws were so detailed and effective that they were copied by governments throughout Asia and eventually influenced European urban planning. Within 50 years, cities from Central Asia to Southeast Asia were implementing building codes and disaster preparedness systems based on laws that had originated in a Mughal emperor's nightmares. And here's the part that gives me chills. Those specific flood scenarios that Akbar kept dreaming about never actually happened in Feta for Sikri, probably because his laws prevented them. But similar flooding patterns occurred in dozens of other cities throughout India and Central Asia over the following centuries, and the cities that had adopted Akbar's legal framework suffered dramatically less damage than those that hadn't. It's almost like Akbar's dreams weren't showing him the future of his own city, but rather providing him with a preview of natural disasters that would affect the entire region over the course of centuries. His subconscious mind had somehow accessed information about flood patterns, climate cycles, and urban vulnerability that wouldn't be understood by scientists for another 400 years. What makes this story even more extraordinary is that Akbar continued to have prophetic dreams about other types of disasters throughout his reign: earthquakes, famines, disease outbreaks, even military threats, and he kept using these dreams as the basis for new laws and government policies. He essentially turned his unconscious mind into a comprehensive disaster prevention consulting service for the entire Mughal Empire. His advisors, initially skeptical about dream-based governance, gradually learned to pay serious attention when the emperor reported unusual or recurring dreams. They developed systematic procedures for analyzing imperial dreams, investigating their practical implications, and translating dream insights into implementable policies. The Mughal court records describe specific instances where Akbar would wake up from a prophetic dream, immediately summon his policy advisors, and spend hours explaining new laws that needed to be written based on what he'd witnessed in his sleep. These weren't vague inspirations or general principles. They were detailed legislative briefings, complete with specific provisions, implementation timelines, and enforcement mechanisms. Akbar's approach to dream-based governance became so systematic and effective that it influenced political theory throughout the Islamic world. The idea that effective rulers should pay attention to unconscious insights about potential problems became an accepted principle of statecraft in several neighboring kingdoms. Modern urban planners and disaster preparedness experts who study Akbar's flood prevention laws are consistently amazed by their sophistication and long-term effectiveness. Many of the principles he established: multiple redundant infrastructure systems, comprehensive emergency preparedness, integration of geological and meteorological factors in urban planning, are still considered best practices in modern city design. Makes you think about how much valuable information might be locked away in the dreams of modern politicians, just waiting for someone brave enough to take their unconscious wisdom seriously. Alright, this one's going to sound completely made up, but it's documented in multiple medieval chronicles and legal records. King Henry II of England, the same guy who accidentally got Thomas Becket murdered, had a recurring nightmare that completely revolutionized how criminal trials work in the Western world. Now, to understand just how revolutionary this story is, you need to know what the English legal system looked like in 1163. It was basically a disaster wrapped in tradition and held together by corruption. Medieval England operated under what historians call customary law, a patchwork of local traditions, royal decrees, and religious rules that varied from county to county and could be interpreted however local officials wanted. The year was 1163, and Henry was dealing with a major crisis in his kingdom. The legal system was completely corrupt and everyone knew it. Judges were taking bribes so openly that there were established fee schedules for different types of verdicts. Wealthy criminals were literally buying their way out of murder charges by paying judges more than the victims' families could afford. Poor people were being executed for minor crimes because they couldn't afford legal protection, while rich nobles were walking free from serious felonies. Henry himself was no saint. He was a tough, pragmatic king who'd inherited a fractured kingdom and spent most of his reign fighting civil wars and consolidating power. But he was also intelligent enough to understand that a corrupt legal system was a threat to royal authority and social stability. If people couldn't trust the courts to deliver justice, they'd eventually take justice into their own hands, and that meant chaos. The problem was that Henry couldn't figure out how to fix the system without completely dismantling it. The existing judges were mostly nobles who'd inherited their positions or clergy who derived their authority from the church. Replacing them would mean political warfare with the aristocracy and the church simultaneously, which could trigger exactly the kind of civil unrest that Henry was trying to prevent. Henry had consulted with legal scholars, church officials, and foreign advisors about possible reforms. Some suggested importing legal traditions from continental Europe. Others recommended strengthening royal control over judicial appointments. And a few proposed creating new administrative positions to oversee existing judges. But none of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem. How do you create a legal system that can't be corrupted by wealth or political influence? Then, in the winter of 1163, something extraordinary happened that would change the course of legal history. Henry started having the same incredibly detailed dream night after night for months. And these weren't vague symbolic dreams or general anxiety nightmares. They were like watching detailed documentary footage of a completely different legal system in action. In the dream, Henry would find himself in a courtroom that looked familiar, but was arranged differently than any court he'd ever seen. Instead of a single judge sitting in elevated authority, there was a group of 12 ordinary citizens sitting together at the same level as the accused and the accusers. These weren't trained lawyers, government officials, or members of the nobility. They were just regular people, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, brewers, bakers, people who knew what real life was like outside the royal court. What made these dreams remarkable was their incredible specificity about legal procedures. Henry could see exactly how these citizen judges would be selected. A royal official would go to the local community and choose 12 people randomly from among those who met basic qualifications. They had to be property owners to ensure they had a stake in maintaining social order. They couldn't be related to the accused or the victim, and they couldn't have personal knowledge of the specific case being tried. The dream showed Henry exactly how evidence would be presented to these citizen judges. Witnesses would testify publicly, where everyone could hear their statements and observe their demeanor. Physical evidence would be displayed and explained. Both the accused and the accusers would have opportunities to present their cases and respond to opposing arguments. Everything would happen in open court, where community members could observe the proceedings. But perhaps most importantly, Henry's dream showed him how these citizen judges would reach their decisions. After hearing all the evidence, they would withdraw to a private space where they could discuss the case freely, without pressure from officials, nobles, or community members who might have strong opinions about the outcome. They would deliberate until they reached either unanimous agreement or a clear majority decision. The level of detail in these dreams was extraordinary. Henry could see specific courtroom layouts, hear exact phrases that would be used in judicial oaths, and watch precise procedures for handling different types of evidence. He dreamed about how citizen judges would handle complex legal questions, how they would deal with conflicting testimony, and how they would weigh different types of proof. What made these dreams even more remarkable was that Henry could see the social and political effects of this new system. He watched corruption virtually disappear because it was nearly impossible to bribe 12 random citizens who were selected just before each trial. He saw poor defendants getting fair hearings because their citizen judges came from similar backgrounds and understood the realities of common life. Henry dreamed about specific cases that demonstrated how this system would work. He saw a wealthy merchant accused of fraud being convicted because the evidence was clear, despite his attempts to use his social connections to influence the outcome. He watched a poor farmer accused of theft being acquitted because the citizen judges understood that the evidence against him was weak and probably motivated by a land dispute. The dream also showed Henry how this citizen judge system would handle cases that involved conflicts between social classes. When a noble was accused of assaulting a commoner, the 12 citizen judges would focus on the evidence rather than the social status of the parties. When a commoner was accused of disrespecting a noble, the citizen judges would determine whether actual laws had been broken rather than just social conventions. But what really convinced Henry that these dreams were showing him something important was that he could see how this system would prevent the specific types of corruption that were plaguing his current courts. Judges couldn't be bribed because there were 12 of them selected randomly. Powerful families couldn't control outcomes because they wouldn't know who the judges would be until just before the trial. Wealthy defendants couldn't buy verdicts because citizen judges wouldn't be dependent on royal favor for their livelihoods. When Henry woke up from these dreams, he didn't just remember vague impressions, he retained detailed, practical information about how this legal system would actually function. He could describe specific procedures, explain the rationale behind different rules, and anticipate how various scenarios would be handled under this new approach. Initially, Henry tried to dismiss these dreams as stress-induced fantasies. He was dealing with enormous political pressures, conflicts with the church, tensions with France, ongoing disputes with his own nobles, and it would have been natural for his subconscious to create elaborate fantasies about solving one of his major problems. But the dreams kept recurring with identical details, and Henry gradually became convinced that his sleeping mind was showing him a real solution to real problems. The legal procedures he was dreaming about were too sophisticated and too consistent to be random fantasy. They addressed specific weaknesses in the current system with practical solutions that seemed both innovative and implementable. Finally, Henry decided to test his advisor's reactions by describing the dream-based legal system in detail. Their responses ranged from polite skepticism to outright alarm about the king's mental state. His chief legal advisor, Ranulph de Glanville, pointed out that allowing common citizens to make judicial decisions would undermine the entire foundation of royal authority. "Your Majesty," he said, "legal decisions require training, education, and understanding of complex precedents. How can a farmer or blacksmith possibly understand the subtleties of canon law, royal prerogatives, or international legal traditions?" His military advisors worried that giving ordinary citizens power over nobles could lead to social rebellion. If commoners got used to judging their social superiors in legal matters, they might start questioning royal authority in other areas as well. Church officials were particularly opposed to the idea, arguing that legal decisions should be made by educated clergy who understood divine law and moral principles. The idea of letting secular commoners decide matters of justice seemed to them both impractical and potentially heretical. Even Henry's closest personal advisors questioned whether he was suffering from some kind of mental strain. The idea of completely revolutionizing the legal system based on recurring dreams seemed like the kind of thing that might indicate a nervous breakdown or divine madness. But Henry was convinced his dreams had shown him something important about justice and fairness that his advisors couldn't see. He'd witnessed firsthand how ordinary people could often make better moral decisions than educated officials because they weren't corrupted by political considerations, personal relationships with powerful families, or financial incentives that influenced professional judges. The citizen judges in his dreams hadn't been stupid or incompetent. They'd been thoughtful, careful, and focused on determining truth rather than advancing their own interests. They'd ask good questions, listened carefully to evidence, and reached decisions that seemed both fair and practical. So Henry made one of the most audacious political decisions in medieval history. Despite enormous opposition from his advisors, the nobility, and the church, he decided to establish the world's first systematic jury trial system, based entirely on procedures he'd seen in his dreams. The Constitutions of Clarendon, issued in 1164, created legal frameworks that were essentially identical to what Henry had dreamed about. 12 citizens would be selected randomly from local communities to hear criminal cases. Evidence would be presented publicly. Judges would deliberate privately before reaching decisions. The accused would have rights to present their case and challenge evidence against them. The implementation of Henry's dream-based legal system was remarkably detailed and sophisticated. The new laws specified exactly how citizen judges would be selected, what qualifications they needed to meet, how they would be instructed about their duties, and what procedures they would follow during trials. Henry established training programs for court officials who would manage jury trials, created standardized oaths for citizen judges, and developed detailed protocols for handling different types of evidence. He even specified how courtrooms should be arranged to accommodate 12 citizen judges rather than a single royal official. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within just a few years, corruption in the English legal system dropped significantly because it became nearly impossible to bribe entire juries selected randomly just before each trial. Poor people started getting fair trials because juries were drawn from their own communities and understood the realities of common life. Innocent people were acquitted more often because 12 minds proved better than one at evaluating evidence and detecting lies or inconsistencies in testimony. Guilty people were convicted more reliably because citizen judges weren't influenced by social status, political connections, or financial incentives that had previously allowed wealthy criminals to escape justice. But perhaps most importantly, public trust in the legal system began to recover. When people saw that their neighbors, ordinary citizens like themselves, were making judicial decisions based on evidence rather than corruption, they regained confidence that justice was actually possible within royal institutions. The success of Henry's jury system was so obvious that it began spreading to other parts of Europe almost immediately. Legal scholars from France, Germany, and Italy came to England to study how citizen juries worked in practice. Within a few decades, modified versions of Henry's system were being implemented in dozens of other kingdoms and city-states. But here's the part that gives me chills. Henry's dream-based legal system was so effective and durable that it became the foundation for criminal justice throughout the Western world. The trial by jury system that we still use today in most Western democracies can be traced directly back to procedures that Henry II saw in his prophetic dreams more than 800 years ago. Modern legal scholars who study the development of jury trials are consistently amazed by the sophistication of Henry's original design. The safeguards against corruption and bias that he built into the system anticipated problems that wouldn't become apparent for centuries. It's as if his sleeping mind had access to centuries of accumulated legal wisdom that hadn't been discovered yet. What's really remarkable is how Henry's dreams seem to solve problems that legal theorists are still working on today. The balance between citizen participation and legal expertise, the relationship between democratic decision-making and professional judicial authority, the challenge of preventing corruption while maintaining efficiency. All of these issues were addressed in the system Henry developed based on his dreams. Henry continued having prophetic dreams about legal issues throughout his reign, and many of his other legal reforms were also based on solutions he'd seen during sleep. He established what was probably history's first systematic approach to dream-based legal innovation, with court officials whose job was to analyze royal dreams for practical judicial applications. The historical records describe specific instances where Henry would wake up from a legal dream, summon his advisors, and spend hours explaining new court procedures that needed to be implemented based on what he'd witnessed in his sleep. These weren't vague inspirations, they were detailed procedural manuals complete with implementation, timelines, and training requirements. Henry's approach to dream-based legal reform became so successful that it influenced political theory throughout medieval Europe. The idea that effective rulers should pay attention to unconscious insights about justice and governance became an accepted principle of statecraft in several neighboring kingdoms. The really wild thing is that modern neuroscience research suggests that sleeping brains are actually excellent at solving complex social problems and making connections that conscious minds miss. During REM sleep, the brain processes vast amounts of information, recognizes patterns that aren't obvious during waking hours, and often generates creative solutions to problems that have been puzzling conscious analysis. Dr. Deirdre Barrett at Harvard Medical School has conducted extensive research on problem-solving dreams, and her studies consistently show that people who go to sleep while focusing on specific challenges often wake up with solutions that are more innovative and effective than what they could develop through conscious analysis alone. This research suggests that Henry's legal dreams might not have been supernatural prophecy at all. They might have been examples of sophisticated unconscious problem solving, with his sleeping brain processing complex information about social dynamics, human psychology, and institutional design to generate practical solutions that his conscious mind couldn't reach. Maybe Henry's unconscious mind had been observing patterns of corruption and injustice throughout his kingdom, analyzing the social and psychological factors that made certain legal procedures effective or ineffective, and synthesizing this information into a comprehensive solution that addressed problems his conscious analysis had missed. Either way, the next time you're called for jury duty, remember that you're participating in a legal system that started because a medieval king was wise enough to trust his dreams more than his advisors. Sometimes the most important innovations in human society come from the strangest and most unexpected places, and sometimes the most effective leadership requires the humility to recognize that our conscious minds don't have all the answers, and the courage to listen when our deeper wisdom is trying to tell us something important about justice, fairness, and what it really means to serve the people we're responsible for protecting. This story takes place in 7th century China, during the reign of Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to hold the title of emperor rather than empress. And I mean that literally. She didn't just rule as a regent or consort, she actually claimed the imperial throne for herself and ruled as Emperor Wu, which was absolutely unprecedented in Chinese history. Now, to understand just how extraordinary this story is, you need to know that Wu Zetian was operating in a political environment where women weren't supposed to have any power at all, let alone control the largest empire in the world. She'd clawed her way to the top through a combination of brilliant political maneuvering, strategic marriages, and what her enemies called ruthless elimination of rivals. By 683 AD, she'd consolidated power so effectively that she controlled not just the imperial court, but the entire governmental apparatus of Tang Dynasty China. Wu was known throughout the empire for being intellectually brilliant, politically ruthless, and remarkably effective at governing a massive, complex civilization that stretched from Korea to Central Asia. She could manage military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, religious conflicts, and economic policies simultaneously while maintaining domestic stability and international respect. She was basically running a superpower using 7th century technology and medieval bureaucracy. But what most history books don't tell you is that some of her most successful and innovative economic policies came from a series of remarkably detailed dreams about agricultural disasters and mass starvation throughout her empire. In the winter of 683 AD, shortly after she'd finished consolidating power and establishing herself as the undisputed ruler of China, Wu began having recurring nightmares that were unlike anything she'd experienced before. These weren't generic anxiety dreams about the pressures of leadership or vague fears about political enemies. They were incredibly detailed, cinematically precise visions of widespread famine throughout specific regions of her empire. In these dreams, Wu would find herself traveling through provinces she knew well, but instead of the prosperous agricultural areas she remembered, she would see landscapes devastated by crop failures, abandoned villages, and roads filled with desperate families searching for food. The level of detail was extraordinary. She could see specific types of crop diseases affecting particular regions, exact weather patterns that would cause agricultural disasters, and individual families suffering from malnutrition and starvation. Wu dreamed about provinces in the north where wheat crops would fail due to unusual drought patterns, southern regions where rice paddies would be destroyed by unprecedented flooding, and western areas where locust swarms would consume entire harvests. But these weren't just general images of agricultural problems. She could see specific villages, particular families and individual children dying of hunger. In one recurring dream that particularly haunted Wu, She saw herself walking through a market town in Hanan province that she'd visited during her rise to power. But instead of the bustling commercial center she remembered, the market was empty except for a few desperate vendors selling tree bark, grass soup, and other starvation foods that people eat when all normal food sources have disappeared. Wu could see specific families in this dream: a middle-aged farmer trying to sell his farming tools to buy grain for his children, an elderly woman offering her few remaining possessions in exchange for a handful of rice, young children with the swollen bellies and listless expressions that indicate severe malnutrition. These weren't anonymous victims. They were individuals whose faces and stories Wu could remember clearly after waking. But what made Wu's economic dreams particularly remarkable was that they didn't just show her the human suffering caused by famine. They showed her the precise bureaucratic and systemic failures that would cause these disasters. She could see government granaries sitting full of grain while people starved just miles away, not because there wasn't enough food, but because local officials were hoarding supplies to sell at inflated prices during the crisis. Wu dreamed about tax collectors arriving in villages that were already experiencing crop failures and demanding payment in grain that families needed to survive the winter. She saw transportation systems that couldn't move emergency food, supplies to affected areas quickly enough to prevent mass starvation. She watched local administrators who were supposed to coordinate disaster relief instead competing with each other for imperial favor while their subjects died. The dreams showed Wu exactly how famines developed, not just from natural disasters like droughts or floods, but from human failures in economic planning, resource distribution, and emergency response. She could see how small initial problems would cascade into enormous tragedies, because the governmental systems weren't designed to handle crisis situations effectively. But here's what made these dreams absolutely extraordinary from an economic policy perspective. They didn't just show Wu the problems. They showed her detailed, implementable solutions. In her dreams, she would see alternative scenarios where different policies prevented the disasters she was witnessing. She dreamed about government grain reserves that could supply emergency food during crop failures, transportation networks that could move supplies rapidly to affected areas, and tax systems that wouldn't worsen agricultural crises. The level of economic detail in these dreams was remarkable and completely unprecedented in Wu's previous experience. She saw specific tax rates that would encourage farmers to grow surplus crops, particular storage techniques that would keep grain fresh during long-term storage, exact transportation routes that would minimize the time needed to deliver emergency supplies, and detailed administrative procedures for coordinating disaster relief efforts. Wu dreamed about what were essentially early forms of crop insurance, government programs that would compensate farmers for losses due to natural disasters, removing the economic incentive for officials to hoard grain during emergencies. She saw tax incentive systems that would encourage merchants to maintain large food reserves, and distribution networks that would ensure emergency supplies reached remote areas before local famines became catastrophic. These dreams contained sophisticated economic concepts that wouldn't be developed by scholars for centuries, things like supply chain management, disaster economics, agricultural subsidies, and what modern economists would recognize as early forms of social safety nets. Wu was essentially receiving graduate-level training in crisis economics during her sleep. When Wu woke up from these dreams, she didn't just remember vague impressions. She retained detailed, practical information about economic policies that could prevent the disasters she'd witnessed. She could describe specific administrative procedures, explain the economic rationale behind different approaches, and anticipate how various scenarios would unfold under different policy frameworks. Initially, Wu tried to analyze these dreams rationally. She was dealing with enormous political pressures, consolidating control over a vast empire, managing relationships with foreign governments, handling religious conflicts between Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and establishing legitimacy as the first female emperor in Chinese history. It would have been natural for her subconscious to process fears about economic disasters that could threaten her rule, but the dreams kept recurring with identical details and increasing urgency. Wu gradually became convinced that her sleeping mind was processing information about real economic vulnerabilities that her conscious analysis had missed. The agricultural and administrative details she was dreaming about were too sophisticated and too consistent to be random fantasy. Wu's advisors were initially skeptical when she started describing these economic dreams, partly because some of the solutions seemed counterintuitive to traditional Chinese economic thinking. She wanted to lower taxes during potential famine years, when the government would need maximum revenue to fund relief efforts. She proposed creating expensive grain reserves when the imperial treasury was already strained by military campaigns and infrastructure projects. She suggested establishing food distribution networks that would cost enormous amounts to maintain, during normal years when they weren't needed. Her chief economic advisor, Li Rengui, pointed out that Wu's dream-based policies would require fundamental changes to the tax system, massive government investment in storage facilities, and creation of entirely new administrative departments to manage disaster preparedness. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said diplomatically, "these proposals would transform how the empire manages its economic affairs. Are we certain that dreams provide sufficient basis for such comprehensive changes?" Military advisors worried that spending enormous amounts on disaster preparedness would weaken the empire's ability to respond to external threats. Resources devoted to grain storage and distribution networks would be unavailable for maintaining armies, building fortifications, or conducting diplomatic initiatives. Traditional Confucian scholars argued that Wu's proposals violated classical economic principles about the proper relationship between government and commerce. They believed that state intervention in agricultural markets would disrupt natural economic relationships and create dependency among farmers who should be self-reliant. Even Wu's closest personal advisors questioned whether the psychological pressures of being China's first female emperor might be causing her to have anxiety dreams about disasters that reflected her fears about political legitimacy rather than actual economic vulnerabilities. But Wu was convinced her dreams were showing her something important about preventing economic disasters that traditional political analysis couldn't detect. She had always been exceptionally skilled at understanding complex economic relationships, managing large-scale administrative challenges, and anticipating political problems before they became serious crises. These dreams felt like extensions of that analytical ability rather than random fantasy. The economic guidance in Wu's dreams was remarkably sophisticated and practical. She saw detailed procedures for establishing grain reserves in every province, with specific storage techniques that would keep supplies fresh for years. She dreamed about transportation systems that would allow rapid movement of emergency food, supplies from surplus regions to areas experiencing shortages. Wu's dreams showed her exactly how to create tax incentive systems that would encourage private merchants to maintain large food reserves, essentially using market mechanisms to create distributed disaster preparedness rather than relying entirely on government storage. She saw administrative procedures for coordinating between different levels of government during emergencies, preventing the kind of bureaucratic confusion that often made natural disasters worse. The dreams also showed Wu innovative approaches to agricultural finance that were centuries ahead of their time. She saw government credit systems that would help farmers recover from crop losses, insurance programs that would compensate for weather-related agricultural disasters, and subsidy systems that would encourage farmers to plant diverse crops rather than depending on single vulnerable staples. So Wu made one of the most audacious economic policy decisions in Chinese history. Despite significant opposition from traditional advisors, she decided to implement the most comprehensive famine prevention program in Chinese civilization, based entirely on policies she'd seen in her dreams. The economic reforms Wu established were extraordinarily detailed and sophisticated. She created government grain reserves in every province with standardized storage facilities designed according to specifications she'd seen in her dreams. These weren't just emergency stockpiles. They were comprehensive food security systems, with detailed procedures for maintaining, rotating, and distributing supplies during both normal and crisis periods. Wu established tax incentive systems that encouraged farmers to grow surplus crops beyond their immediate needs, creating market-based motivations for agricultural overproduction that would provide natural buffers against crop failures. She developed transportation networks specifically designed for moving food supplies rapidly from surplus regions to areas experiencing shortages. The new economic laws also included innovative financial concepts that were centuries ahead of their time. Wu created what were essentially early forms of crop insurance, with government programs that would compensate farmers for losses due to natural disasters. She established emergency credit systems that would help farming communities recover from agricultural setbacks without falling into permanent debt. Wu's reforms included agricultural subsidy programs that encouraged farmers to experiment with diverse crops, reducing regional dependence on single staples that might be vulnerable to particular diseases or weather patterns. She created administrative positions for agricultural specialists, whose job was to monitor crop conditions throughout the empire and provide early warnings about potential problems. The implementation of Wu's dream-based economic policies required enormous administrative innovation. She had to create entirely new government departments, train thousands of officials in disaster management procedures, and establish communication systems that could coordinate emergency responses across an empire that stretched thousands of miles. Wu also had to develop new economic theories to justify her policies to traditional scholars who were skeptical about extensive government intervention in agricultural markets. She articulated philosophical frameworks that balanced Confucian principles about governmental responsibility with practical approaches to economic management that seemed to violate classical assumptions. The results of Wu's economic reforms were immediate and remarkable. Within just a few years, China's ability to respond to agricultural crises improved dramatically. When crop failures occurred in individual provinces, the government's food reserve and distribution systems prevented local shortages from becoming regional famines. During Wu's reign, China experienced several major natural disasters that should have caused widespread famine and social unrest, severe droughts in northern provinces, unprecedented flooding in southern regions, and locust swarms that consumed entire harvests in western areas. But because of the economic systems Wu had established based on her dreams, these potential disasters were managed effectively with minimal loss of life. The Chinese historical records document specific instances where Wu's disaster preparedness systems prevented catastrophic famines. During a severe drought in 687 AD, government grain reserves and transportation networks supplied emergency food to affected provinces before mass starvation could occur. When floods destroyed rice crops in southern regions in 691 AD, Wu's economic systems redistributed food supplies from unaffected areas so effectively that most people didn't even experience significant food shortages. What's fascinating is that Wu's dream-based economic policies worked so well that they were maintained and expanded by subsequent dynasties for over 300 years. Laws and administrative systems that originated in one woman's nightmares became the foundation for Chinese agricultural and economic policy throughout the medieval period and beyond. But here's the part that makes this story almost supernatural. Many of the specific famines that Wu had dreamed about actually occurred years later in the exact regions and with the precise characteristics she'd seen in her sleep. Her dreams had somehow provided accurate early warnings about agricultural disasters that wouldn't happen for decades, giving her government time to develop prevention systems before the crises occurred. Modern economists who study Wu's policies are consistently amazed by their sophistication and long-term effectiveness. She created economic systems that addressed problems most governments didn't understand for another 1,000 years. Her approaches to disaster economics, agricultural finance, and emergency management incorporated principles that wouldn't be rediscovered by Western economists until the modern era. Wu continued having prophetic economic dreams throughout her reign, and she kept using them as the basis for new policies and administrative innovations. She established what was probably history's first systematic approach to dream-based economic planning, with court officials whose job was to analyze imperial dreams for practical policy applications. The Chinese court records describe specific instances where Wu would wake up from an economic dream, summon her policy advisors, and spend hours explaining new laws that needed to be written based on what she'd witnessed in her sleep. These weren't vague inspirations, they were detailed policy briefings, complete with implementation timelines, budget requirements, and administrative procedures. Wu's approach to dream-based economic governance became so effective that it influenced political theory throughout East Asia. The idea that effective rulers should pay attention to unconscious insights about economic challenges became an accepted principle of statecraft in several neighboring kingdoms. The transformation of Chinese economic policy under Wu was so comprehensive that it essentially created the institutional foundation for disaster preparedness throughout East Asia. Systems that originated in one emperor's prophetic dreams became the basis for agricultural and economic management throughout the region for centuries. Wu Zixin's story demonstrates that effective economic leadership sometimes requires the wisdom to recognize that conscious analysis can miss important patterns and relationships that are visible to unconscious processing. Her dreams provided her with early warnings and practical solutions that saved millions of lives over the centuries, creating economic policies that were both innovative and remarkably durable. And her story reminds us that the most effective form of political leadership often requires the humility to listen when you're deepest. Unconscious wisdom is trying to tell you something important about how to serve the people you're responsible for protecting. This final story from our main section takes place during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, summer of 1787. Alexander Hamilton, yes, the guy from the musical, though he was considerably more complex and controversial than Lin-Manuel, Miranda made him seem was struggling with one of the most difficult questions in American political theory. How do you protect individual rights in a democracy where the majority rules? Now, to understand just how revolutionary and terrifying this problem was in 1787, you need to know that Hamilton and the other founding fathers were essentially conducting a political experiment that had never been attempted before in human history. They were trying to create a large-scale democratic republic, a form of government that classical political theorists had declared impossible and that contemporary European intellectuals considered a recipe for chaos and eventual tyranny. Hamilton himself was a fascinating and contradictory figure. He'd been born in the Caribbean as the illegitimate son of a failed merchant, had immigrated to New York as a teenager with basically nothing, and had managed to become one of the most influential political theorists in America through sheer intellectual brilliance and relentless ambition. He was simultaneously a passionate advocate for democratic principles and deeply worried about the potential dangers of democratic governance. The problem that was keeping Hamilton awake in Philadelphia wasn't just theoretical, it was urgently practical. The Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at national government, were failing because they were too weak to solve major national problems. But creating a stronger central government raised the terrifying possibility that democratic majorities could vote to oppress minorities or individuals if there weren't strong constitutional protections in place. Hamilton had been reading extensively about historical examples of democratic governments that had failed, and he was deeply concerned about what political theorists called the tyranny of the majority. The idea that democratic majorities could use their voting power to destroy the very freedoms that democracy was supposed to protect. Ancient Athens had voted to execute Socrates for expressing unpopular ideas. The Roman Republic had voted itself into dictatorship. More recently, some American state governments had passed laws that violated individual rights simply because the majority supported them. The challenge was figuring out how to create a government strong enough to solve national problems, but not so strong that it could be used by temporary majorities to oppress people who disagreed with them. Hamilton needed to design constitutional mechanisms that would protect individual rights even when the majority wanted to violate them, but without making the government so weak that it couldn't function effectively. Hamilton had consulted with legal scholars, studied historical examples from around the world, and corresponded with European political theorists about possible solutions to this dilemma. Some suggested creating strong courts that could overrule democratic decisions. Others recommended complex voting procedures that would make it difficult for majorities to act quickly. A few proposed constitutional amendments that would be nearly impossible to change, even if future majorities wanted to eliminate individual rights. But none of these solutions address the fundamental tension between democratic governance and individual liberty. How do you create a system where the people rule themselves, but where certain fundamental rights are protected even from the people themselves? Then, on the night of July 14, 1787, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed, Hamilton had a nightmare that crystallized his fears and, more importantly, showed him specific constitutional solutions that would become some of the most important parts of the American political system. In his dream, Hamilton found himself in a small American town that looked like dozens of communities he'd visited throughout New York and New England. The houses were familiar, the streets were recognizable, and the people looked like typical American farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. But something was terribly wrong with the political atmosphere. In this dream town, a political majority had decided that a particular family, Hamilton's sleeping mind, gave them the name Washington, which was either coincidence or his subconscious sense of humor were somehow threatening to the community's safety and prosperity. The reasons were vague and seemed to be based more on rumors, fear, and resentment than on any actual evidence of wrongdoing. Hamilton watched in horror as this Democratic majority held public meetings, conducted votes according to their local constitution, and made decisions that were technically legal but obviously unjust. They voted to confiscate the Washington family's property because someone claimed they were hiding assets from tax collectors. They voted to prevent the family from practicing their religion because someone else claimed their beliefs were dangerous to community values. They voted to exile the family from the town because yet another person claimed they were plotting against local government. What made this dream particularly disturbing was that everything the mob was doing was technically democratic and constitutional according to their local laws. They held public meetings where everyone could speak. They conducted fair votes where all eligible citizens could participate. They followed their written constitution and legal procedures. But the result was obviously unjust and violated basic principles of human rights that Hamilton believed should be protected even from democratic majorities. In the dream, Hamilton could see individual faces of people participating in these mob decisions, and they weren't evil or malicious. They were ordinary citizens who genuinely believed they were protecting their community from a perceived threat. They were farmers worried about their economic security, merchants concerned about unfair competition, and parents afraid for their children's safety. Their motivations were understandable, even sympathetic, but their actions were destroying innocent people. Hamilton watched the Washington family trying to defend themselves through the available legal procedures, but the system provided no protection against majority tyranny. The local courts were controlled by elected judges who represented the same majority that wanted to persecute the family. The legislative body was composed of representatives chosen by the same voters who supported the oppressive measures. Even the executive officials were accountable to the same Democratic majority that was driving the injustice. But here's what made this dream remarkable from a constitutional perspective. As Hamilton witnessed this nightmare scenario of democratic tyranny, he began seeing specific institutional mechanisms that could prevent such injustices without destroying democratic governance itself. In the dream, Hamilton saw courts that were independent from electoral politics, staffed by judges who served for life and therefore couldn't be intimidated or influenced by temporary political majorities. He watched these independent judges reviewing the town's anti-Washington laws and striking them down as violations of constitutional principles that were more fundamental than majority opinion. The dream showed Hamilton exactly how this judicial review system would work. The independent courts wouldn't be able to make policy decisions or overrule democratic choices about ordinary political questions, but they would have the power to protect certain fundamental rights that were considered so important that even democratic majorities couldn't violate them. Hamilton saw a specific list of individual rights that would be protected by constitutional amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to own property, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to legal representation, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. These rights would be written into the Constitution in such clear language that even biased judges couldn't interpret them away. The dream also showed Hamilton elaborate procedural safeguards that would slow down democratic decision-making and force more careful consideration of complex issues. Instead of allowing simple majority votes on important questions, the constitutional system he envisioned would require supermajorities for certain types of decisions, multiple votes separated by cooling-off periods, and complex amendment procedures that would prevent temporary political passions from permanently damaging individual rights. But perhaps most importantly, Hamilton's dream showed him how to balance these protections for individual rights with effective democratic governance. The independent courts couldn't overrule democratic decisions about ordinary policy questions. They could only protect fundamental constitutional principles. The procedural safeguards would slow down decision-making but not prevent it entirely. The constitutional amendment process would be difficult but not impossible, allowing for necessary changes while protecting core principles. The level of detail in Hamilton's constitutional dream was extraordinary. He could see specific court procedures, exact voting requirements for different types of legislative decisions, detailed appointment processes for judges, and precise language for constitutional amendments. He dreamed about how different branches of government would check and balance each other, preventing any single institution from accumulating too much power. When Hamilton woke up from this nightmare, he didn't just remember vague impressions about the dangers of majority tyranny. He retained detailed, practical information about constitutional mechanisms that could protect individual rights without destroying democratic governance. He could describe specific institutional designs, explain the rationale behind different procedural safeguards, and anticipate how various political scenarios would unfold under different constitutional frameworks. Initially, Hamilton tried to analyze his dream rationally. He was under enormous stress during the Constitutional Convention. The delegates were divided on fundamental questions about national government. Some states were threatening to withdraw from the Union entirely, and there was growing public pressure to produce a constitution that could solve America's political problems quickly. But the constitutional solutions Hamilton had seen in his dream were too sophisticated and detailed to be random fantasy. They addressed specific weaknesses in existing American governments while avoiding the obvious problems that would arise from other potential solutions. The dream had essentially provided him with a comprehensive constitutional theory that balanced individual rights with democratic governance in ways that conscious political analysis hadn't achieved. Hamilton immediately began writing detailed notes about the constitutional mechanisms he'd seen in his dream. He filled dozens of pages with descriptions of independent courts, judicial review procedures, individual rights amendments, and complex checks and balances between different branches of government. These notes became the foundation for many of the most important parts of the American Constitution, things like the federal court system, the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court's power of judicial review, the complex amendment process, and various institutional safeguards that prevent any single branch of government from becoming too powerful. What's particularly fascinating is that Hamilton's dream-based constitutional ideas were initially controversial among the other founding fathers. Many of them thought his protections against majority rule were too restrictive and would make the government ineffective. They couldn't see why democracy needed so many complicated safeguards against its own citizens. James Madison worried that independent federal courts with the power to overrule state laws would undermine federalism and create conflicts between national and local governments. Thomas Jefferson thought that extensive individual rights amendments were unnecessary because state constitutions already protected most civil liberties. Even George Washington questioned whether the complex institutional checks and balances Hamilton proposed would make the government too slow and inefficient to respond effectively to national emergencies. But Hamilton was convinced his dream had shown him something crucial about the relationship between democratic governance and individual liberty that his fellow delegates couldn't see. He argued passionately that democracy without constitutional protections for individual rights would eventually destroy itself through majority tyranny, while constitutional protections without effective democratic institutions would create an unaccountable aristocracy that could oppress the people just as effectively as democratic mobs. The Federalist Papers that Hamilton wrote to promote the Constitution were heavily influenced by insights from his nightmare about majority tyranny. Federalist No. 78, which explains the rationale for independent federal courts, draws directly from scenarios Hamilton had witnessed in his dream. Federalist No. 84, which discusses the need for a Bill of Rights, describes specific types of individual rights violations that Hamilton had seen in his sleep. Many of Hamilton's most powerful arguments about the need for constitutional protections came directly from the nightmare scenario he'd experienced. When he wrote about the dangers of faction and the importance of institutional safeguards against temporary political passions, he was essentially describing what he'd witnessed in his dream about the persecution of the Washington family. Hamilton's constitutional theory, as expressed in the Federalist Papers and his speeches during the ratification debates, was remarkably sophisticated and prescient. He identified potential problems with American democracy that wouldn't become apparent for decades or centuries after the Constitution was written, and he designed institutional solutions that proved effective at preventing exactly the kinds of problems he'd foreseen. The Constitutional Convention ultimately adopted most of Hamilton's dream-based ideas, though often in modified forms that reflected compromise with delegates who had different concerns. The federal court system they created was essentially identical to what Hamilton had seen in his dream. The Bill of Rights they eventually added to the Constitution protected exactly the individual rights Hamilton had identified as most vulnerable to majority tyranny. The complex system of checks and balances between different branches of government, the elaborate amendment process that makes constitutional changes difficult but not impossible, and the various procedural safeguards that slow down democratic decision-making, all of these features of American government can be traced directly to constitutional mechanisms that Hamilton saw in his nightmare about majority tyranny. And here's what gives me chills about this story. Many of the constitutional crises that America has faced throughout its history have been exactly the kind of majority tyranny situations that Hamilton dreamed about. The constitutional protections he designed based on his nightmare have prevented countless injustices and protected individual rights in situations he somehow foresaw while sleeping. During the Civil War, federal courts used judicial review powers to protect individual rights from state governments that wanted to violate them. During the McCarthy era, constitutional protections prevented political majorities from completely destroying civil liberties, even though they came close. During the Civil Rights Movement, independent federal courts struck down state laws that violated individual rights exactly as Hamilton had envisioned. Modern constitutional scholars consider Hamilton's insights about majority tyranny and individual rights to be remarkably prescient. He identified and solved constitutional problems that political theorists are still working on today, the tension between democratic governance and individual liberty. The challenge of creating effective government that can't become tyrannical, the difficulty of protecting minority rights and systems based on majority rule. It's as if Hamilton's dream gave him access to the entire future history of American democracy, complete with previews of every constitutional crisis and information about which institutional mechanisms would be needed to resolve them, fairly without destroying either individual rights or democratic governance. What's really remarkable is that Hamilton continued to have political dreams throughout his career, and many of his other policy ideas were also influenced by solutions he'd seen in sleep. He used his unconscious mind as a kind of constitutional research and development laboratory, processing complex information about institutional design and political theory in ways that his conscious analysis couldn't achieve. The financial system Hamilton designed for the new American government, his approaches to federal-state relationships, and even his theories about political parties and electoral competition were all influenced by insights from dreams that showed him how different institutional arrangements would affect American political development over the long term. Hamilton's approach to dream-based constitutional thinking became influential among other American political leaders, though most of them didn't discuss it publicly because dream-based policymaking didn't fit with Enlightenment expectations about rational governance. But private correspondence and diary entries from several founding fathers indicate that many of them paid attention to political insights that came to them during sleep. The American constitutional system that emerged from the Philadelphia Convention was essentially a practical implementation of political theory that Hamilton had developed based on his nightmares about majority tyranny and his dreams about institutional solutions to democratic governance problems. Laws and governmental structures that originated in one founder's sleeping mind became the foundation for American democracy and influenced constitutional development throughout the world. Sometimes the most important protections for democracy come from politicians who are wise enough to listen to their worst nightmares about what could go wrong, and creative enough to design institutional solutions that prevent those nightmares from becoming reality. And sometimes the most effective constitutional theory comes not from abstract philosophical analysis, but from the practical wisdom that emerges when our unconscious minds process complex information about human behavior, institutional design, and the eternal tension between individual liberty and collective governance. Queen Christina of Sweden, brilliant, eccentric, and eventually famous for abdicating to become a Catholic, had a very specific recurring nightmare about fires in wooden buildings that would change how Europeans thought about urban safety forever. This was in 17th century Stockholm, where most construction was wood and fire was a constant, terrifying presence in daily life. Medieval cities were basically tinderboxes waiting to explode, narrow streets lined with wooden houses, built so close together that you could reach from one second-story window to touch the house across the street. Add in open flames for cooking and heating, primitive chimney construction, and no organized firefighting services, and you had a recipe for regular urban disasters. Christina herself was one of the most remarkable rulers of her era. She spoke 9 languages fluently, corresponded with Descartes about philosophy, and ran Sweden during its golden age as a European superpower. But she was also deeply practical about the boring details of governance that other monarchs ignored. While her royal contemporaries were building elaborate palaces, Christina was obsessing over things like tax collection efficiency, road maintenance, and urban planning. Starting in early 1654, Christina began having the same nightmare every few nights. In her dreams, she would be standing in the center of Stockholm, on a calm winter evening when suddenly she would see a small orange glow in a window of a wooden house about 3 blocks away. Nothing unusual about that. People cooked and heated their homes with fire every day. But in the dream, Christina could see exactly how this small, ordinary fire would spread with devastating speed through the interconnected wooden structures of the city. She watched flames jump from house to house through shared walls, spread along wooden roof lines, and travel through narrow alleyways filled with wooden debris and stored materials. What made these dreams particularly vivid was Christina's ability to see specific architectural details that would either help or hinder the fire's progress. She could see exactly which buildings had inadequate separation from their neighbors, which wooden construction techniques created natural pathways for flames, and which structural features would trap people during evacuations. In her dreams, Christina watched families discovering too late that their escape routes were blocked by smoke and flames. She saw children separated from their parents in the chaos, elderly people unable to climb out of upper-story windows, and entire neighborhoods consumed by fires that spread faster than people could run. But what made Christina's fire dreams remarkable from an urban planning perspective was that they didn't just show her the disasters. They showed her detailed architectural solutions that would prevent them. She dreamed about specific building design modifications that would slow fire spread, construction techniques that would contain fires to individual structures, and urban planning approaches that would facilitate evacuation and firefighting. The level of architectural detail in these dreams was extraordinary. Christina saw building designs with fire-resistant barriers between rooms that would prevent flames from spreading throughout entire structures. She dreamed about window configurations that would facilitate escape during emergencies, with specific size requirements and positioning that would allow people to climb out safely. She saw construction techniques that used fire-resistant materials strategically placed to create breaks in otherwise wooden buildings. Christina dreamed about roof designs that would prevent flames from jumping between structures, and foundation techniques that would protect buildings from fires that started in neighboring properties. Most remarkably, Christina's dreams showed her comprehensive urban planning approaches that would make entire cities more fire-resistant. She saw requirements for minimum distances between buildings, regulations about the types of materials that could be used for different types of construction, and even early concepts for professional fire inspection and prevention services. When Christina woke up from these dreams, she retained incredibly detailed technical information about construction and fire prevention that went far beyond her previous knowledge of architecture. She could describe specific building techniques, explain the physics of how fires spread through different materials, and design urban planning policies that would address problems she'd never consciously considered. Christina's advisors were initially puzzled when she started discussing detailed fire prevention policies. Sweden hadn't experienced any major urban fires recently, and fire prevention wasn't typically considered a high priority for royal attention compared to military affairs, international diplomacy, or economic management. But Christina was convinced her dreams were showing her something important about urban safety that traditional planning had overlooked. She commissioned detailed studies of Stockholm's construction practices, interviewed builders about fire-resistant techniques, and consulted with the few fire prevention experts who existed in 17th century Europe. What Christina discovered through this investigation confirmed many of the vulnerabilities she'd seen in her dreams. Stockholm's wooden construction practices did create numerous pathways for rapid fire spread. Building spacing was inadequate to prevent fires from jumping between structures. Window designs in many buildings would indeed trap residents during fire emergencies. Based on what she'd learned from her dreams and confirmed through investigation, Christina created Europe's first comprehensive building fire codes. These weren't just general recommendations, they were detailed legal requirements with specific technical standards and enforcement mechanisms. The new Swedish fire codes required firewalls between rooms in all new construction, with specifications for materials and thickness that would contain fires for specific periods of time. Buildings had to include minimum window sizes for emergency escape, positioned to allow safe evacuation from upper floors. Christina established maximum building heights for wooden construction, recognizing that taller wooden buildings created escape and firefighting challenges that existing technology couldn't handle effectively. She also created minimum distance requirements between structures, preventing the kind of close spacing that allowed fires to jump easily from building to building. But perhaps most innovatively, Christina's fire codes created the world's first professional fire inspection system. Government officials were trained to recognize fire hazards in existing buildings and new construction, with authority to require safety modifications and prevent dangerous building practices. The results of Christina's fire prevention policies were immediate and dramatic. Stockholm's fire risk decreased significantly, and when fires did occur, they were much more likely to be contained to single buildings rather than spreading throughout entire neighborhoods. But the long-term impact was even more remarkable. Christina's fire prevention laws were so effective that they were copied throughout Northern Europe within a few decades. Building regulations that started in a queen's nightmares became the foundation for construction, safety standards that influenced urban development across the continent. Cities throughout Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands adopted modified versions of Christina's fire codes. The specific technical standards she developed, requirements for firewalls, window sizes, building spacing, and construction materials, became standard features of European urban planning. And those specific fire scenarios she kept dreaming about never actually happened in Stockholm, probably because her laws prevented them. But similar fire patterns occurred in dozens of other European cities that hadn't adopted Sweden's fire codes, with exactly the catastrophic results Christina had seen in her sleep. The Great Fire of London in 1666, just 12 years after Christina's fire codes were implemented, demonstrated exactly the kind of urban fire disaster that her policies had been designed to prevent. London's wooden construction and narrow streets created the perfect conditions for rapid fire spread, destroying over 13,000 houses in just 4 days. When European urban planners studied the London fire, They discovered that cities which had adopted Christina's fire prevention standards suffered much less damage from similar disasters. The specific architectural features and urban planning approaches she developed based on her dreams proved remarkably effective at preventing the kind of catastrophic fire spread that devastated London. Christina's fire prevention legacy influenced European architecture for centuries. The technical standards she established became foundational principles for construction safety, and many of her innovations remained standard practice well into the industrial era. Modern fire safety experts who study Christina's codes are consistently impressed by their sophistication and practical effectiveness. She identified and solved fire prevention problems that weren't fully understood by engineering until the modern era, creating safety systems that saved countless lives over the centuries. During the Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, Venice faced an unprecedented crisis that would test every aspect of its sophisticated commercial civilization. The deadly plague was sweeping across the continent like a dark tide, killing a third of the population wherever it struck, and Venice, as the most important trading hub connecting Europe with Asia and the Middle East, found itself directly in the path of this invisible destroyer. The city's position as the crossroads of medieval commerce made it simultaneously the wealthiest and most vulnerable place in Europe. Ships arrived daily from Constantinople, Alexandria, Crimea, and dozens of other ports, carrying not just the silks, spices, and precious goods that made Venice rich, but also the microscopic agents of death that no one yet understood. In this atmosphere of growing terror and confusion, something extraordinary began happening to Andrea Dandolo, the Doge of Venice. This wasn't just any political leader. Dandolo was known throughout Europe as one of the most intelligent and practical rulers of his age, a man who had guided Venice through complex diplomatic and military challenges with remarkable skill and foresight. But starting in early 1348, Dandolo began experiencing a series of vivid, recurring dreams unlike anything he had ever encountered before. These weren't the typical anxiety dreams of a leader under pressure, nor were they the symbolic religious visions common in medieval culture. Instead, they were incredibly detailed, almost scientific observations of disease transmission that seemed to come from some unknown source of knowledge. In these dreams, Dandolo would find himself invisible, floating above the bustling harbors of Venice, watching the normal activities of commerce and trade. But instead of seeing only the visible world of merchants, sailors, and cargo, he could somehow perceive something else, dark, shadowy figures moving silently among the crowds, touching specific individuals who would then, within days, develop the characteristic symptoms of plague. The dreams showed him that these shadowy figures, which he understood to represent the invisible agents of disease, could move from person to person through direct contact. But they could also survive on objects and in materials for extended periods. He saw plague spreading through contaminated clothing, infected cargo, and even through the air in enclosed spaces where sick people had been breathing. What made Dandolo's dreams particularly remarkable was their scientific accuracy about concepts that wouldn't be formally understood for centuries. He saw that many people could carry and spread the plague without showing any symptoms, themselves the phenomenon we now call asymptomatic transmission. He observed that the disease had a specific incubation period, during which infected people were contagious but appeared completely healthy. Most remarkably, his dreams revealed the crucial role of rats and fleas in spreading the plague, though he didn't understand the biological mechanism. He just saw that ships with large rat populations were invariably the ones that brought disease to Venice, and he noticed that the mysterious shadow figures seemed to move between rats and humans in patterns he couldn't quite comprehend. The level of detail in these dreams was extraordinary and impossible to dismiss as imagination. Dandolo could see specific ships arriving in Venice's harbor and predict with uncanny accuracy which ones carried plague. He could identify individual sailors and merchants who would fall ill days before they showed any symptoms. He could even see which areas of the city would be most affected by outbreaks, based on patterns of trade and human movement that his conscious mind hadn't analyzed. When Dandolo began sharing these dreams with his advisors and the Venetian council, Their reactions ranged from polite concern to barely concealed alarm about the Doge's mental state. Venice in 1348 was a sophisticated commercial society, but it was still a medieval culture where most people believed disease was caused by divine punishment, corrupted air, or imbalances in bodily humors. The idea that an invisible contagion could spread through human contact, survive on objects, and be carried by asymptomatic individuals was not just foreign to medieval medical thinking, it was almost incomprehensible. Most physicians of the era would have dismissed Dandolo's dream-based theories as dangerous superstition that could interfere with proper medical treatment. But Dandolo was convinced that his dreams were showing him something crucial about preventing a catastrophe that could destroy Venice entirely. He had always been a practical leader who made decisions based on careful analysis of evidence, and these dreams felt like extensions of that analytical ability rather than random fantasy or religious vision. The medical guidance in Dandolo's dreams was remarkably sophisticated and detailed. He saw exactly how long ships needed to be isolated to ensure that any hidden plague had time to manifest itself, not an arbitrary period, but a specific time frame based on the disease's incubation period. He dreamed about procedures for examining people and cargo for signs of infection and methods for disinfecting materials that might carry the plague. So, Dandolo made one of the most audacious public health decisions in medieval history. Despite enormous opposition from Venice's powerful merchant families, who feared economic disaster from any interruption to trade, he established the world's first systematic quarantine system, based entirely on information he had received through dreams. The new quarantine laws were extraordinarily detailed and comprehensive. All ships arriving in Venice had to anchor at designated points outside the main harbor for exactly 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, which is where our modern word quarantine comes from. During this period, no person, animal, or cargo could leave the ships without specific permission from health officials. Venice established special quarantine stations called lazarettos on remote islands in the lagoon, where ships could dock safely while remaining isolated from the main population. These weren't just holding areas, they were sophisticated medical facilities with procedures for examining people and goods, treating the sick, and disposing of contaminated materials. The quarantine system included detailed protocols for different types of cargo and different levels of suspected infection. Cloth goods, which Dandolo's dreams had shown him could harbor plague for extended periods, had to undergo special fumigation procedures. Spices and other organic materials were stored in specific ways that would allow any hidden contamination to dissipate safely. Perhaps most remarkably, the Venetian quarantine laws included provisions for identifying and isolating asymptomatic carriers, people who appeared healthy but were actually infected and contagious. This was medical knowledge that wouldn't be formally understood until the development of germ theory in the 19th century. But Dandolo's dreams had somehow provided him with accurate information about this crucial aspect of epidemic control. The implementation of Venice's dream-based quarantine system required enormous administrative innovation and expense. The city had to construct entirely new facilities, train hundreds of officials in disease detection and prevention, and develop complex procedures for managing international trade while maintaining public health safeguards. The results were immediate and dramatic. While other European cities were losing 30 to 50% of their populations to the Black Death, Venice's mortality rate remained significantly lower. The quarantine system wasn't perfect. Some plagues still entered the city, but it prevented the kind of catastrophic outbreak that devastated places like Florence, Paris, and London. More importantly for the long-term course of history, Venice's quarantine model became the template for epidemic control throughout Europe and beyond. Within a few decades, dozens of other ports had adopted similar systems based on the procedures that Dandolo had developed from his prophetic dreams. The word quarantine itself, derived from Dandolo's 40-day isolation period, became the standard term for epidemic control measures in every European language. Legal and medical concepts that originated in one man's dreams became fundamental principles of public health that are still used today. Modern epidemiologists who study the Black Ages Death are consistently amazed by the scientific accuracy of Venice's quarantine procedures. They incorporated principles of infectious disease control that weren't formally understood for centuries, the role of incubation periods, the importance of asymptomatic transmission, the need for decontamination procedures, and the value of systematic isolation protocols. What makes this story even more remarkable is that many of the specific disease patterns Dandolo had seen in his dreams proved to be accurate predictions of how plague would spread throughout Europe. His dreams had somehow provided him with advanced information about epidemic dynamics that allowed Venice to prepare for a disaster before it fully materialized. Andrea Dandolo's story represents one of the most documented and successful examples of dream-based governance in medieval history, and it had consequences that literally saved thousands of lives and influenced public health policy for centuries to come. After the Great Kanto earthquake of 1703, which devastated much of eastern Japan and killed over 100,000 people, Shogun Tokugawa Inobu began experiencing a series of recurring dreams that would revolutionize architecture and construction throughout the Japanese archipelago. These weren't ordinary nightmares about natural disasters. They were incredibly detailed visions of building techniques and structural engineering principles that wouldn't be formally understood by seismologists and architects for another 2 centuries. To understand just how extraordinary this story is, you need to know that Japan in 1703 was already one of the most earthquake-conscious civilizations in the world. The Japanese had been building with seismic activity in mind for over 1,000 years, developing construction techniques that allowed wooden buildings to flex and sway rather than break during ground movement. But the 1703 earthquake had revealed that even these traditional methods weren't adequate for the most severe seismic events. Inobu himself was a fascinating figure, a cultured and intellectually curious ruler who had studied Chinese philosophy, Japanese poetry, and Western science with equal intensity. He was known for his practical approach to governance and his interest in technological innovation, but he was also deeply spiritual and believed that effective leadership required attention to both rational analysis and intuitive insight. The dreams that began visiting Inobu in the aftermath of the earthquake were unlike anything he had experienced before. In these visions, he would find himself walking through earthquake-damaged areas, but instead of seeing only destruction and suffering, he could see buildings that had survived because of specific design features that seemed to defy conventional understanding. He watched wooden structures that bent and swayed like bamboo in the wind, absorbing seismic energy rather than resisting it. He saw foundations that seemed to float on the ground rather than being rigidly anchored to it, allowing buildings to move independently of soil motion. He observed roof systems that distributed seismic forces throughout the building frame in ways that prevented catastrophic structural failure. But what made Inobu's architectural dreams truly remarkable was their incredible technical detail. He could see specific joinery techniques that used flexible wooden connections rather than rigid metal fasteners, allowing structural elements to move relative to each other without breaking. He dreamed about foundation designs that included shock-absorbing materials, layers of sand, gravel, and specially treated wooden elements that could cushion buildings from ground motion. The dreams showed him how different building materials responded to seismic stress in ways that seemed to contradict everything Japanese builders thought they knew about construction. Heavy tile roofs, which were considered prestigious and durable, actually made buildings more vulnerable during earthquakes because their weight created enormous inertial forces during ground shaking. Lighter wooden roofs with specific truss designs were not only safer but actually helped stabilize the entire structure. Inobu dreamed about revolutionary concepts like base isolation, the idea of decoupling a building's foundation from ground movement so that seismic energy couldn't be transmitted directly to the superstructure. He saw buildings sitting on systems of wooden rollers and flexible supports that allowed them to remain stable even when the earth beneath them was shaking violently. Perhaps most remarkably, his dreams included detailed information about soil behavior during earthquakes. He saw how different types of ground, rocky, sandy, clay-based, responded to seismic waves, and how building foundations needed to be designed differently depending on local soil conditions. He dreamed about the phenomenon that modern engineers call liquefaction, where saturated soil temporarily behaves like a liquid during strong ground shaking. The level of engineering sophistication in these dreams was extraordinary and completely unprecedented in 18th century Japan. Inobu was essentially receiving graduate-level training in earthquake engineering during his sleep, complete with detailed technical specifications and performance criteria that wouldn't be developed by Western seismologists until the 20th century. When Inobu began describing these architectural dreams to his advisors and master builders, their reactions were mixed but generally skeptical. Japanese construction techniques had evolved over centuries and were considered among the most earthquake-resistant in the world. The idea that a non-technical ruler could receive revolutionary engineering insights through dreams seemed implausible to many practical-minded builders. But Inobu was convinced that his dreams were showing him something important about preventing the kind of catastrophic building failures that had killed so many people during the 1703 earthquake. He commissioned detailed studies of earthquake damage patterns, interviewed survivors about how different buildings had performed during the disaster, and consulted with the most experienced builders and engineers in Japan. What Inobu discovered through this investigation confirmed many of the construction principles he had seen in his dreams. Traditional Japanese building techniques, while generally effective, had several vulnerabilities that became critical during the most severe earthquakes. Rigid connections between structural elements often failed catastrophically. Heavy roofs created dangerous dynamic loads during ground shaking. Foundations that were too deeply anchored could transmit damaging seismic energy directly to building superstructures. Based on what he had learned from his dreams and confirmed through investigation, Inobu initiated the most comprehensive revision of Japanese building codes in the country's history. These weren't just general recommendations, they were detailed technical standards with specific performance requirements and enforcement mechanisms. The new earthquake-resistant building codes required flexible wood joinery in all construction, using traditional Japanese carpentry techniques, but with modifications that Inobu had seen in his dreams. Buildings had to incorporate specific ratios of structural flexibility that would allow them to deform during earthquakes without failing catastrophically. Foundation designs were completely revolutionized based on principles Inobu had dreamed about. Instead of rigidly anchoring buildings to bedrock, the new codes required foundation systems that could absorb and dissipate seismic energy. These included layers of different materials, sand, gravel, specially treated wooden elements, arranged in patterns that modern engineers would recognize as early forms of base isolation. The building codes also established height restrictions based on seismic risk assessments that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Inobu's dreams had shown him that taller buildings required different structural approaches than shorter ones, and that the relationship between building height, structural design, and seismic performance was much more complex than traditional builders understood. Perhaps most innovatively, the new codes created Japan's first systematic construction inspection system specifically focused on earthquake safety. Government officials were trained to recognize seismic hazards in building design and construction, with authority to require safety modifications and prevent dangerous building practices. The implementation of Inobu's dream-based building standards required massive changes throughout Japanese society. Traditional builders had to learn new techniques. Construction materials had to be sourced and processed differently, and entire communities had to rebuild using methods that seemed foreign and expensive compared to conventional practices. But the results were remarkable. When the next major earthquake struck the region in 1707, buildings constructed according to Inobu's new codes suffered dramatically less damage than traditional structures. The death toll was a fraction of what it had been during the 1703 earthquake, despite the later quake being of similar magnitude. More importantly for the long-term development of earthquake engineering, Inobu's building standards became the foundation for seismic design throughout East Asia. The specific technical principles he had developed based on his dreams, flexible joinery, base isolation, soil-specific foundation design were so effective that they influenced construction practices in China, Korea, and eventually throughout the seismically active Pacific Rim. Japanese earthquake architecture became so sophisticated and effective under Inobu's guidance that it attracted attention from European engineers and architects who were struggling with seismic problems in their own countries. Construction techniques that had originated in one shogun's dreams became the basis for earthquake engineering developments that saved countless lives over the following centuries. Modern seismologists and structural engineers who study historical Japanese building techniques are consistently amazed by the sophistication of Inobu's codes. He identified and solved earthquake engineering problems that weren't formally understood by Western science until the development of modern seismology and structural dynamics in the 20th century. The principles that Inobu established based on his dreams, the importance of structural flexibility, the need for base isolation, the relationship between soil conditions and foundation design remain fundamental concepts in earthquake engineering today. Buildings throughout the seismically active world continue to benefit from insights that first appeared in the sleeping mind of an 18th century Japanese ruler. Lord Ashley, who would later become the Earl of Shaftesbury, was a member of the British Parliament. During one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Industrial Revolution that was reshaping English society in ways both miraculous and terrifying. This wasn't just any politician. Ashley was known for his moral conviction and his ability to see social problems that other leaders preferred to ignore. But what catalyzed his legendary campaign for child labor reform was a series of dreams, so vivid and disturbing that they fundamentally changed his understanding of what industrial progress was costing English society. In the early 1830s, as England was becoming the world's first industrialized nation, most people in positions of power had little direct knowledge of what was actually happening inside the textile mills, coal mines, and factories that were generating unprecedented wealth. The Industrial Revolution was creating prosperity for business owners and investors, but the human cost of this progress was largely hidden from public view. Ashley himself came from an aristocratic background and might easily have remained oblivious to these conditions. But starting in late 1832, he began having recurring nightmares that showed him scenes from inside English, factories with documentary-level detail and emotional impact that left him shaken and determined to investigate what he was seeing. In these dreams, Ashley would find himself walking through textile mills where children as young as 5 years old were working 14-hour shifts in conditions that seemed designed to break both bodies and spirits. These weren't just general images of industrial suffering. He could see specific children, individual faces marked by exhaustion and malnutrition, particular injuries caused by dangerous machinery, and exact working conditions that seemed almost too horrible to believe. He dreamed about children whose job was to crawl beneath moving machinery to collect cotton fibers, constantly risking being crushed by equipment that never stopped running. He saw young girls working as scavengers, cleaning and oiling machines while they operated, frequently losing fingers or hands to unguarded gears and belts. He watched boys as young as 6 working in coal mines, pulling heavy carts through narrow tunnels in absolute darkness for 12 hours at a time. But what made Ashley's dreams particularly powerful was their emotional authenticity. He didn't just see these children working, he could feel their exhaustion, their fear, their physical pain, and their hopelessness about ever escaping these conditions. He would wake up crying, feeling as though he had actually experienced the suffering of specific individual children whose faces and stories remained vivid in his memory. The level of detail in these dreams was extraordinary and impossible to dismiss as imagination. Ashley could see particular factories, specific types of machinery, exact working procedures, and individual supervisors whose behavior toward child workers ranged from indifferent to deliberately cruel. He could even see the physical effects of different types of factory work, how textile dust caused respiratory problems, how malnutrition stunted growth, how dangerous machinery caused specific types of injuries. What disturbed Ashley most deeply was that his dreams showed him children who had been bright, curious, and full of potential before entering factory work. but who were gradually being destroyed by conditions that treated them as expendable machinery rather than human beings. He saw how long hours, dangerous work, and lack of education were creating a generation of English, children who would never have the opportunity to develop their abilities or improve their circumstances. Initially, Ashley tried to dismiss these dreams as anxiety-induced fantasies. He was dealing with enormous political pressures as a member of parliament during a period of rapid social change, and it would have been natural for his subconscious to process concerns about the social costs of industrialization through vivid nightmare imagery. But the dreams kept recurring with identical details and increasing emotional intensity. Ashley gradually became convinced that his sleeping mind was somehow accessing real information about factory conditions that his conscious awareness hadn't encountered. The industrial workplaces he was seeing in his dreams were too specific and too consistent to be random fantasy. Finally, Ashley decided to investigate whether the conditions he was seeing in his dreams actually existed in English factories. What he discovered through direct observation and interviews with factory workers matched his dreams with horrifying accuracy. The specific injuries, working conditions, and child suffering he had witnessed in his sleep were happening in hundreds of factories throughout England. Children as young as 5 were indeed working 14-hour shifts in dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. Factory owners were using child labor not just as a source of cheap workers, but as a way to perform tasks that adult workers couldn't do, crawling into small spaces, working with intricate machinery, handling materials that required small fingers and quick reflexes. The factory system had created a form of legalized child abuse that was hidden from public view but was absolutely essential to the profitability of English manufacturing. Without child labor, many of the products that made England wealthy, textiles, pottery, metalwork, coal, couldn't be produced at competitive prices. But Ashley had seen something in his dreams that most factory investigations missed: the individual humanity of these child workers. His dreams had shown him not just the physical conditions of factory work, but the psychological and emotional impact on children who should have been playing, learning, and developing normally instead of serving as human machinery in industrial production. Based on what he had seen in his dreams and confirmed through investigation, Ashley began drafting what would become the Factory Act of 1833, the first comprehensive child labor protection law in British history. This wasn't just a general statement of principles. It was detailed legislation with specific protections, enforcement mechanisms, and penalties for violations. The Factory Act limited working hours for children based on age categories that Ashley had seen in his dreams. Children under 9 were prohibited from factory work entirely. Children aged 9 to 13 could work no more than 8 hours per day and had to receive 2 hours of education daily. Children aged 1418 could work no more than 12 hours per day and were entitled to specific safety protections. The law also required safety equipment and training for young workers, established government inspectors to enforce these protections, and created penalties for factory owners who violated child labor standards. These weren't just recommendations. They were legal requirements backed by government enforcement and criminal sanctions. Perhaps most importantly, the Factory Act established the principle that society had a responsibility to protect children from economic exploitation, even when that exploitation was profitable for employers and seemingly necessary for industrial production. This was a revolutionary concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between economic progress and human welfare. The implementation of Ashley's child labor laws faced enormous opposition from factory owners, who argued that restricting child labor would make English manufacturing uncompetitive and damage the national economy. Many politicians and economists claimed that child labor was a necessary evil that allowed poor families to survive and gave England its industrial advantages over other countries. But Ashley was convinced that his dreams had shown him something important about the long-term social costs of treating children as industrial equipment. A society that sacrificed its children's development, health, and education for short-term economic gain was ultimately destroying its own future prosperity and moral foundation. The results of the Factory Act were immediate and dramatic. Child mortality rates in industrial areas decreased significantly. School attendance increased as children were freed from excessive factory work. The overall health and development of working class. Children improved measurably as they gained protection from the most dangerous and exploitative forms of labor. But the long-term impact was even more significant. Ashley's Factory Act became the model for child labor laws throughout the industrialized world. Legal protections that had originated in one politician's nightmares became the foundation for children's rights legislation in dozens of countries. The principles that Ashley established, that children deserve protection from economic exploitation, that society has a responsibility to ensure basic standards for child welfare, that industrial progress shouldn't come at the cost of destroying young lives, became fundamental concepts in labor law that continue to guide international standards today. Modern child welfare experts and labor historians who study the development of children's rights consistently point to Ashley's Factory Act as a crucial turning point in how societies think about the relationship between economic development and human welfare. His dream-based legislation helped establish the idea that some things, including the welfare of children, are more important than maximizing industrial profits. The English child labor laws that emerged from Lord Ashley's prophetic dreams literally saved the lives and futures of hundreds of thousands of children, and they created legal and moral frameworks that continue to protect children throughout the world today. Before we drift off into whatever dreams await us tonight, let me share a few lesser-known stories about political dreams that almost nobody talks about, but that shaped our world in quiet, important ways. The Icelandic Parliament dreams, 930 AD, there's this beautiful, almost forgotten story about how the world's oldest parliament was established based on a series of shared dreams experienced by Viking chieftains in Iceland. In the year 930 AD, Iceland was settled by independent Viking families who couldn't agree on how to govern themselves. They had no king, no central authority, and no legal system beyond personal honor codes. It was basically organized chaos, which worked fine for raiding parties, but not so well for permanent settlements with farms, families, and long-term disputes that needed resolution. The problem was that these Viking chieftains were scattered across an island the size of Kentucky, separated by mountains, glaciers, and weeks of dangerous travel. They rarely communicated with each other and had no tradition of cooperative governance. Each family group handled its own problems and conflicts through violence, exile, or uneasy truces that could explode into blood feuds at any moment. Then something extraordinary happened. Over the course of several months, multiple chieftains across Iceland began having similar dreams about a gathering place where disputes could be resolved peacefully through discussion rather than violence. These weren't vague dreams about cooperation, they were incredibly specific visions of a particular geographical location and detailed legal procedures. In these dreams, they saw a dramatic rift valley with natural stone formations that would serve as speaking platforms, elevated areas where different speakers could address large gatherings, and acoustic properties that would allow hundreds of people to hear legal arguments and testimony. They dreamed about specific voting systems that would represent all the major clans fairly, about judicial procedures that would allow both accusers and accused to present their cases, and about rituals that would make legal decisions binding and sacred. What makes this story almost supernatural is that these Viking leaders, who lived hundreds of miles apart and rarely communicated with each other, all dreamed about the same location and similar legal procedures. When they finally met to compare their dreams, they realized they were all seeing the same vision of democratic governance in the same specific place. They found the exact location that had appeared in their dreams, a place called Thingvellir, where geological forces had created a natural amphitheater with remarkable acoustic properties. The stone formations were exactly as they had dreamed them. The sight lines were perfect for large gatherings, and the location was accessible from settlements throughout Iceland. Based on these shared dreams, they established the Althing, which became the foundation for parliamentary democracy throughout Northern Europe. The legal procedures they developed, public testimony, structured debate, representative voting, binding decisions, were essentially identical to what they had seen in their collective dreams. The Althing wasn't just a talking society or ceremonial gathering. It had real power to resolve disputes, establish laws, and make decisions that affected thousands of people across Iceland. The legal innovations that emerged from Viking dreams became the model for democratic institutions that influenced political development throughout Scandinavia and eventually the rest of Europe. The Mayan calendar correction, 822 AD, deep in the rainforests of the Yucatan, a Mayan astronomer king named Jasa Chan. Keowil was having mathematical dreams that were more accurate than his waking calculations. The Maya had developed the most sophisticated calendar system in the ancient world, more precise than anything Europeans would achieve for another 1,000 years. Their astronomical observations were so accurate that they could predict eclipses, planetary movements, and celestial events with remarkable precision. But by 822 AD, their calculations were starting to drift slightly out of alignment with actual celestial events. This was a serious political and religious crisis because Mayan kings derived their authority partly from their ability to predict astronomical phenomena. If the royal astronomers couldn't accurately forecast eclipses and planetary movements, it would undermine the entire basis of royal legitimacy and religious authority. Jasa Chan Keowil was not just a political ruler, but also a trained mathematician and astronomer who understood the complexities of Mayan calendar calculations better than almost anyone in the empire. He had been working for months trying to identify the source of the mathematical errors that were causing their predictions to become inaccurate. Then he began having dreams where he could see mathematical corrections to the Mayan calendar system that were too complex and precise to be random fantasy. In these dreams, he saw specific numerical adjustments involving incredibly sophisticated astronomical cycles, calculations that took into account the slight variations in planetary orbits, the precession of equinoxes, and other celestial mechanics that wouldn't be formally understood by European astronomers for centuries. The mathematical details in these dreams were extraordinary. Jasa Chan Keowil saw corrections involving prime numbers, complex fractions, and astronomical cycles that required understanding of mathematical concepts the Maya weren't supposed to have developed. When he implemented the adjustments he had seen in his sleep, the Mayan calendar became even more accurate than it had been before. Modern astronomers who study the Mayan calendar system are amazed by the precision of these dream-based mathematical corrections. They solved astronomical calculation problems that wouldn't be understood by European science for another 700 years. And they made the Mayan calendar more accurate than the Gregorian calendar that Europeans wouldn't adopt until the 16th century. The Tibetan trade route vision, 1042 AD in the mountains of Tibet, a king named Trisong Detsen had dreams about trade routes that connected his isolated mountain kingdom with the rest of Asia in ways that seemed impossible given the geographical barriers. Tibet in 1042 AD was one of the most isolated civilizations in the world, surrounded by some of the highest mountains on Earth and cut off from international commerce for most of the year by weather that made travel impossible. The kingdom had developed a sophisticated culture and political system, but it was economically limited by its geographical isolation. Trisong Detsen began having remarkably detailed dreams about trade routes through the Himalayan mountains that would allow Tibet to become a major commercial hub connecting China, India, Central Asia, and the Middle East. In his dreams, he could see specific mountain passes that could be used for trade, exact seasonal timing for when these routes would be passable, and detailed information about which goods would be most valuable for long-distance commerce. But what made these dreams extraordinary was their geographical accuracy about terrain that Trisong Detsen had never personally explored. He saw precise information about mountain passes, river crossings, weather patterns, and seasonal variations that would allow merchants to travel safely between regions that had never been connected by regular trade routes. The trade routes that Trisong Detsen established based on his dreams became some of the most important economic connections in medieval Asia. They created unprecedented prosperity in Tibet, established commercial relationships that lasted for centuries, and helped spread Buddhist culture, Chinese technology, Indian scholarship, and Islamic science throughout the region. What's remarkable is that modern geographers who study these ancient trade Roots are amazed by their efficiency and practical design. They represent sophisticated understanding of mountain geography, seasonal weather patterns, international commerce, and cultural exchange that seemed impossible for an isolated mountain kingdom to possess through normal means. The Portuguese navigation dreams, 1488 AD, Bartolomeu Dias, the Portuguese explorer who first sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, reportedly had prophetic dreams about ocean currents and wind patterns that allowed him to navigate waters no European had ever explored. Portuguese navigation in the 5th–10th century was the most advanced in Europe, but it was still largely based on coastal sailing and known sea routes. The idea of sailing around the southern tip of Africa into completely unknown waters was terrifying because navigators had no reliable information about currents, weather, or geography in the southern Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Dias began having detailed dreams about ocean and weather patterns in waters he had never sailed. In these dreams, he could see how Atlantic currents flowed around the African continent, where seasonal winds would help or hinder sailing, and what navigational landmarks would guide ships through unknown waters. The navigational information in Dias's dreams proved remarkably accurate and enabled him to complete the first successful European voyage around Africa. His dream-based navigation techniques became the foundation for Portuguese exploration of the Indian Ocean and helped establish the sea routes that connected Europe with Asia for the first time in history. Modern oceanographers who study historical navigation records are impressed by the accuracy of the ocean current and wind pattern information that Dias somehow accessed through his dreams. His understanding of southern hemisphere maritime conditions was more accurate than European navigation knowledge would be for another century. These obscure stories remind us that throughout history, some of the most important innovations and discoveries have come from sources that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding. Dreams, visions, and intuitive insights have guided human development in ways that challenge our assumptions about knowledge, discovery, and the relationship between consciousness and reality. Sometimes the most important information comes not from books, teachers, or systematic research, but from the mysterious processes that occur when our conscious minds are quiet and our deeper awareness can access patterns and relationships that aren't visible during waking hours. As you prepare to enter your own dreams tonight, remember that sleep has always been humanity's gateway to insights that couldn't be reached any other way. In the quiet spaces between waking and sleeping, between conscious thought and unconscious wisdom, lie possibilities that might change not just your own life, but the world around you. Perhaps tonight, in your own dreams, you'll glimpse something important that your waking mind hasn't noticed. Perhaps you'll see solutions to problems that have been puzzling you, or understand relationships that haven't been clear, or access wisdom that comes from sources deeper than ordinary thinking. The boundary between dreams and reality has always been more permeable than we usually acknowledge. The stories we've explored tonight show us that sometimes our sleeping minds can see further, understand more, and access information that changes the course of human history. Sweet dreams, and remember, the most important discoveries often come when we're brave enough to listen to voices that speak only in the darkness. Throughout human history, the relationship between dreams and political power has been much more significant than most of us realize. Ancient civilizations didn't make the sharp distinction we do between sleeping visions and waking reality. For them, dreams were simply another source of information about the world, sometimes more reliable than what they could observe with their conscious minds. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs employed professional dream interpreters whose job was to analyze royal dreams for political and economic guidance. These weren't court entertainers or superstitious advisors. They were highly educated priests who studied patterns in royal dreams and looked for practical information that could guide government policy. The Egyptian dream interpretation system was remarkably sophisticated. They kept detailed records of royal dreams, analyzed correlations between dream content and subsequent events, and developed what were essentially early forms of statistical analysis to identify which types of dreams provided reliable information about future events. Similar systems existed in ancient Mesopotamia, where Babylonian and Assyrian kings regularly based military and economic decisions on guidance they received through dreams. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest written legal systems, includes several laws that were reportedly inspired by King Hammurabi's prophetic dreams about justice and social order. In ancient China, the concept of the mandate of heaven included the idea that legitimate rulers received guidance from the divine realm through dreams and visions. Chinese emperors were expected to pay attention to their dreams as a source of information about how to govern effectively and maintain cosmic harmony. What's particularly interesting is that these ancient dream-based governance systems seem to work reasonably well. Civilizations that took royal dreams seriously often had more stable governments, more effective legal systems, and better disaster preparedness than those that ignored their leaders' unconscious insights. Modern sleep research offers some fascinating insights into why political dreams might actually be valuable sources of information. During REM sleep, the brain processes vast amounts of information, makes connections between seemingly unrelated concepts, and often comes up with creative solutions to complex problems. Dr. Deirdre Barrett at Harvard Medical School has conducted extensive research on problem-solving dreams. Her studies show that people who go to sleep while focusing on specific problems often wake up with solutions that are more creative and effective than what they could develop through conscious analysis. This research suggests that political leaders who pay attention to their dreams might actually be accessing sophisticated unconscious analysis of complex social, economic, and political information. Their sleeping brains might be processing subtle patterns and relationships that their conscious minds can't detect. There's also fascinating research on what neuroscientists call temporal displacement during dreaming. Some studies suggest that during certain phases of REM sleep, the brain's normal temporal processing gets disrupted, potentially allowing access to information patterns that exist across different time periods. Dr. Julia Mosbridge at Northwestern University has published papers suggesting that the unconscious mind can sometimes detect patterns and make predictions that the conscious mind isn't aware of. Her research indicates that the brain might be constantly processing subtle environmental and social cues, with this information sometimes emerging in dreams before it reaches conscious awareness. This could explain why some political dreams seem to contain accurate information about future events. Rather than supernatural prophecy, these might be examples of sophisticated unconscious pattern recognition, sleeping minds, detecting social and political trends that haven't yet become apparent to conscious analysis. Medieval European kingdoms had their own complex relationships with royal dreams and political decision-making. Many medieval legal codes included provisions for what to do when a king received important information through dreams, and some kingdoms had official positions for royal dream interpreters. The concept of divine right of kings often included the idea that legitimate monarchs received guidance from God through dreams and visions. This wasn't just religious belief, it was practical political theory about how effective leadership worked. What's remarkable is how often medieval kings' dream-based decisions turned out to be politically and socially beneficial. Laws that originated in royal dreams often addressed problems that traditional political analysis had missed, and many of these dream-inspired legal innovations lasted for centuries. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, European intellectuals became more skeptical about dream-based governance, viewing it as superstitious and irrational compared to systematic political analysis. But even during this period, many successful political leaders continued to pay private attention to their dreams while publicly emphasizing rational decision-making processes. The American founding fathers were particularly interesting in this regard. Many of them kept detailed dream journals and wrote about the political insights they gained through sleep, even as they created governmental systems based on Enlightenment rationality. Thomas Jefferson wrote extensively about political dreams and their relationship to democratic governance. He believed that leaders in a democracy had a special responsibility to pay attention to, unconscious insights that might reflect the needs and concerns of the people they served. Benjamin Franklin conducted informal experiments with dream-based problem-solving, deliberately focusing on specific political or diplomatic challenges before sleep and then recording whatever solutions or insights emerged during dreams. John Adams kept detailed records of his political dreams throughout, his presidency and often discussed them with trusted advisors as one source of information about complex governmental challenges. Even in the modern era, many effective political leaders have reported using dreams as sources of insight about complex policy challenges. They just don't talk about it publicly because dream-based decision-making doesn't fit with contemporary expectations about rational political analysis. But maybe there's something important that we've lost by dismissing the political value of dreams. Maybe our ancestors understood something about the relationship between unconscious wisdom and effective governance that we've forgotten in our emphasis on purely rational decision-making. Modern neuroscience research suggests that some of our most important insights about complex social problems might come from unconscious processing during sleep. If that's true, then political leaders who ignore their dreams might be missing valuable information about the challenges they're trying to solve. The relationship between sleep and political insight seems to be particularly strong during periods of major social change or crisis. Throughout history, the most innovative political solutions often emerged when leaders were willing to consider unconventional sources of insight, including their own unconscious minds. Maybe the most effective form of political leadership isn't just about conscious analysis of data and trends. Maybe it also requires the wisdom to listen when your sleeping mind is trying to tell you something important about the people and problems you're meant to serve. If you're somehow still awake at this point, which would honestly surprise me, you've just journeyed through some of the strangest intersections between political power and prophetic dreams in human history. From Constantine's legal revolution to Hamilton's constitutional nightmares, from Chinese empresses preventing famines to Swedish queens stopping fires, we've seen how some of the most important laws in human civilization originated not in legislative chambers or royal courts, but in the mysterious space between sleep and waking. These stories remind us that effective leadership sometimes requires listening to sources of wisdom that can't be found in books, briefing papers, or expert consultations. Sometimes the most important insights about serving others and solving complex social problems come to us when our conscious minds are quiet and our deeper wisdom can finally be heard. What strikes me most about these political dreamers is that they were willing to trust insights that seemed irrational, impractical, or impossible to explain. Constantine could have dismissed his dreams as stress-induced fantasy. Akbar could have ignored his flood visions as groundless anxiety. Henry II could have rejected his jury system dreams as medieval superstition. But they didn't. They had the courage to act on information that came from sources their advisors couldn't understand or verify. They were willing to risk their reputations, their resources, and sometimes their lives on insights that emerged from the darkness of sleep rather than the clarity of conscious analysis. And in every case, their dream-based policies proved to be remarkably effective and durable. Laws that originated in sleeping minds became the foundations for legal systems, economic policies, and governmental structures that lasted for centuries and influenced the development of human civilization around the world. Maybe that's the most important lesson from these stories, that the most effective leadership sometimes requires the humility to recognize that our conscious minds don't have all the answers. Sometimes the solutions we need most desperately can only be found in the quiet spaces where rational thought gives way to deeper forms of understanding. I'd love to know where you're drifting off tonight and whether any of these political dream stories resonated with your own experiences of meaningful dreams. Drop a comment below with your location and maybe share any dreams you've had that felt like they contained important information about the world around you. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these explorations of how dreams have shaped our world in ways we rarely recognize. We'll be back next week with another journey into the strange connections between sleeping minds and waking reality. And who knows, maybe tonight you'll dream about laws that need to be changed, problems that need solutions, or ways to make the world a little bit better for the people around you. Sometimes the most important political insights don't come from pundits or polls. They come from having the wisdom to listen when our dreams are trying to tell us something important about justice, compassion, and what it really means to serve others. Sleep well, and remember, The most powerful changes in the world often begin with someone who was brave enough to trust their dreams, even when everyone else thought they were crazy. See you in your dreams.